On today's show, I'm going to be talking with Stephen Shaviro, and this is kind of special for me. I first met Stephen about 27 years ago when he taught at the University of Washington. But before that, he has had, even more impressive credentials. He graduated from Yale University with a PhD. He taught film studies, amongst other things, at the University of Washington, and now teaches at Wayne University in Detroit. As if that wasn't enough, he's really into French philosophy, literary theory, but to keep things balanced, he also likes science fiction, music videos, David Cronenberg, and one thing that makes him very, very cool, he really likes Dean Martin. If you ever find yourself in a room with him, there's no doubt he will be the smartest man in that room. That could be anywhere from Denny's to the DMV or even the teacher's lounge at Wayne University. So I could go on and on, but I just want to dive in because I've got so much to talk about. So welcome to the show, Stephen.
Thanks, Kelly, for that introduction. Overly gushing, but okay, I can live with it.
And I didn't even talk about the fact you've written like at least 11 books that I know of.
Mm-hmm.
So
there's one coming out, but not for another year.
Well, I'll twist your arm later on for some details of that. But, I've got so many motives for wanting to do this. But one, my little perverted motive for wanting you to be on this podcast is if you do a search, I find you in all these literary journal type things and very scholarly academic websites and blogs. And I just want after this, when someone Googles you, that they find you connected to this trashy podcast.
Well, I'm happy to do it. When I met you, because I was a big fan of Heart Attack Theater all those years ago, and I like stuff like that in general. So,
I was going to say that kind of leads to what I was going to say is, there's so much we can talk about today. It was really hard for me to narrow it down because literally you have so many interests, you have so much in your background. But one thing I've realized over the years, even though someone can have a lot of knowledge or a lot of facts and figures, instead of being overwhelmed by that at first, sometimes it's just good to start out with just a nice story that people can relate to. And I think when I read theory and things, I always like it when someone can relate it to a story or humanize that philosopher or whatnot. So I'm wondering if, 27 years ago, do you remember that night that we met at 911 Media Arts in Seattle?
I can remember, I don't know if it's 911 or someplace else, but I can remember your questioning me about movies starring Fabio or something like that.
Oh, that's funny. I think I did. I did several film programs at 911 Media Arts. And I think I had a couple, but the one on Fabio is where I was trying to predict what would become the cult films of the future.
Yeah.
And there was this like a VHS video of Fabio like doing these mini romantic dramas. And I said, to me, this is going to be the next cult or the next camp classic or kitsch. And I think I was pretty good. I think Fabio definitely falls in that category now.
Yeah.
But I think the one I'm remembering, and maybe you were at this one and mentioned something, but at one point I did a screening at 911 Media Arts, where it was a compilation of my show Heart Attack Theater. It's kind of like a best of, and then we had a Q&A. And I just remember at the very end, I don't even know if you talked during the program, but at the end, I think when we were like having coffee in the back, you introduced yourself. I mean, oh my God, someone actually, I don't know is here, first of all. When you go to these events and it's most of your friends, I thought that shifty kind of look of, oh my God, does he like this? Does he hate it? Is he some wacko that wants me off public access TV? And instead you say, oh, I really like your show. In fact, I record some of the episodes. And by the way, I'm the film studies professor at the University of Washington.
Well, I don't remember our meeting I don't remember that instant of our meeting, but it makes sense. And, it was true. I don't really do it much these days, but now it's totally different with YouTube and everything. But I used to troll public access to see something which was interesting and which is not going on in major media.
Well, besides the ego boost, what really impressed me was that you were a university professor who actually came out to a very grassroots screening when obviously you'd have your pick of things to do. And it renewed my hope that, someone in academia could actually appreciate something that was very homegrown and grassroots.
Well, I think things have changed in academia over the years and the decades. And, you know, now at Wayne State University, I have graduate students who set up, symposiums about comic books where they find local comics creators who self-publish their comics and have them come and talk about them. And so it's sort of, universities have changed, and one of the changes is that it's much less exclusive than it used to be.
Well, we're going to get into that a little bit too, and just to make sure that you're going to have fun with this, we will talk about Prince a little bit later.
Okay. I love Prince. Yeah.
But when you talk about synchronicity, I meet you at 911 Media Arts. And for those who don't know, Seattle, the University of Washington, is in an area called the University District. And I lived just a couple blocks from campus at the time, and just a couple blocks from the University Bookstore, which was an amazing bookstore in town, not just for textbooks, but for, all kinds of books.
Science fiction.
Science fiction.
Science fiction section.
And I swear it was maybe a week after I met you, and this was just totally by coincidence. I'm there in the film section, which I used to hang out, and go to at least once a week, when I wasn't down the street at Bulldog News looking for film-related zines. But I came across your book, The Cinematic Body, and I'm looking at it, and it took a while for me to connect and look at, your byline and say, oh my God, this is that film professor I met. And so, of course, I bought it. And what struck me is, and maybe I was kind of naive at the time, early 90s, but in the pre-internet era, it was really hard to find people who wrote in a scholarly way about popular culture, and especially in your scholarly way, which adds another layer of, through the lens of French philosophy, and, in such a challenging but interesting way. But you wrote about David Cronenberg and Andy Warhol and, Fassbinder's movie of Carell. But the thing, I so love was you wrote about George Romero, and now it's so commonplace to analyze, zombie films. But at the time, no one was really doing what you were doing.
No, I think, I'm actually proud of this because a couple of years ago, they came out with a book from one of the presses called Zombie Theory. And it's just articles by academics over the years about zombies and zombie movies and zombies in popular culture and so on and so forth. And my chapter on George Romero from many years ago was the first thing in the book, because they told me, well, this is the really first academic thing which really took zombies seriously. So, now I'm at a different university, and I have a colleague whose major work is on zombies. She's written 2 books on zombies and is writing more. And she's seen every zombie movie, which at this point I certainly haven't. But, I sort of feel happy that I seem to have been at the beginning of, bringing that into dialogue and talking about it in this kind of way. And I think it goes both directions. It's not just that I'm trying to drag Night of the Living Dead into some highfalutin culture discourse, but I'm also trying to open up, interested in literature, film, and culture, that there's lots of stuff going on. It's not just on one level. So,
Well, back then, how were you perceived by your colleagues? Because you wrote, which is still fairly academic, but it was, presented as more of, a mainstream, film studies book. At the time, were you derided at all for picking that subject matter?
Well, no, not really. Thing is, things have changed and are still changing in academia, and this was kind of the beginning of that change. Basically the same year, within a year or two of my book coming out, where I talked about Romero and Cronenberg and stuff like that, a book was published which actually in academia is much more famous than mine, and it's accessible enough. I recommend it. It's called Men, Women, and Chainsaws
Hmm.
by Carol Clover, who was a professor at University of California, Berkeley. And it was all about slasher movies and rape revenge movies and things like that. And she gave, a theoretical treatment, but also a very accessible one. And so I didn't know her or didn't meet her until after that our both books came out. So I wrote them independently, but the fact that, those both came out around the same time shows that something was starting to happen. And,
Hmm.
and in academia, widening its interests and widening, its understanding of culture was part of that. So, I was really, I may have done it independently, but I turned out that I was part of a wave which I didn't know was also happening with other people around me.
What was also going on at the time, I remember Camille Paglia was putting out, fairly scholarly books, but that were more marketed to the mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
I think the big one right before yours, she put out Sexual Persona.
Yeah.
And that really grabbed me and made me think a lot differently about pop culture. And
Mm-hmm.
she was kind of the person who embraced Madonna and said, hey, pop culture is a serious part of our study.
Yeah, well, she's gotten, more conservative in her older age. She wrote something a couple of years ago just dissing Lady Gaga and saying Lady Gaga's no Madonna. But, I, I, as you get older, I think one of the most important things for me is to try to keep up with what younger people are doing. It's really
Mhm.
like this happens a lot with music. Almost anybody my age, I'm in my 60s, your favorite music is the music from when you were in your teens and 20s. So
Mhm.
I try very hard to avert that by trying to reach out and listen and check out stuff from which younger people are find popular, which younger people are doing. And there's always good stuff. There's always terrible stuff, but it's good to try
Mhm.
to hook into some of the good stuff that's going on among younger people. I really think it's vitality. It's I don't want to pretend I'm young when I'm not, but I also don't want to be in a closed world where like anything happening generation behind me doesn't register anymore. I think it's important to be engaged.
Mhm. In academia, is it easy to get stuck in a rut?
I'm not in that. Well, okay, I could talk for hours about academia. A lot of it would be too much inside baseball. It would really bore most of your listeners. But basically, um, there are many good things about academia right now, which is a lot of it is that academia is so much more open and there's a much wider range of stuff that people are respected for working on. So,
Mhm.
there's a lot of popular culture studies in academia today, and that's really a good thing. It just widens. I'm not against writing on any of the old stuff, but it widens the range of stuff. And if you're interested in the world, you should be interested in all this stuff. And
Mhm.
um, on the other hand, academia is going through real financial. It's been underfinanced for years. There are very few jobs. I'm really worried. I have brilliant graduate students, and I'm worried whether they'll get a good teaching job. They won't be as lucky as I was because when I started in academia, there was many more jobs. It was much easier to get a job. Now, you have instead of being, you know, I don't know. It's just when we last time we hired a film person, which was a good while ago, we got like 150 applications for just one job.
Mhm.
And they certainly, when
Wow.
I got my job at the University of Washington in 1984, there certainly wasn't anything like that kind of ratio. So your chances were much better.
Mhm. And
So,
I think for a mainstream university that wasn't specifically a film school, for me, just to know that the University of Washington, say, had a film studies class,
well,
it seems commonplace, but back then these
no,
things seemed special.
there's a story about that, which you may or may not know. So the university, before I came to the University of Washington in 1984. Before I came in the early 80s, they had some really good people doing film studies classes, and they all got fired because the president of the university didn't think there was a budget crisis, and the president of the university didn't think it was a worthwhile topic for universities to engage in. So when I came, there was one class in the book, books are educationally, but the very good people who had taught film studies before had all been laid off. And then basically I was part of a group of people. There were people, higher in the hierarchy and more powerful than me. We were all sort of waiting for this president to retire so that he'd be replaced by another president who'd be more open to what was happening. And that's what eventually happened. So once that president retired, there was a new president of the university. we proposed the film studies program, we went through all the bureaucratic hoops, we got it started. But, it was kind of, now it's so much taken for, well, now it's more taken for granted, but still, film studies is booming relatively in academia, but except that academia as a whole has budget cuts and less jobs. But, things have really changed.
Well, I was at the University of Washington a couple of years before you started teaching there, and one of my favorite classes I took was on American popular music. And
Yeah.
again, at the time, it was like, oh, this sounds cool. At the time, it seemed like one of those, they used to joke about, oh, basket weaving, like the easy,
Yeah.
fun
Yeah.
classes. And I think a lot of people perceived it as
Yeah.
that. But when you
The
went
film
into it, I
classes,
go,
they said, for film
yeah,
classes, they say, oh, it's like getting credit for eating popcorn. Ha,
right. But boy, the guy who taught it was great. And we, had a great survey from, I think, back, Tin Pan
Yeah.
Alley,
Mhm.
early 1900s up to the present. And I
Yeah.
thought, this is such an engaging way to learn something. And I don't know if that was still, a class when you were teaching there, but it seems like there was a turning of the tide in the 80s when popular
Yes.
culture was being taken more seriously.
That is right. I mean, that's still true of English departments and humanities departments today. But as I said, except the entire university has underfunded humanities for the last 10 or 15 years. But that was after humanities changed and became more open to a wider array of things.
hmm
Yeah.
Well, what I really want to concentrate on today is to talk about how we can review and analyze popular culture, and especially horror and cult cinema, but pop culture in general, but from an intellectual angle. We live in an era with instant, access through blogging, podcasting, YouTube
Yeah.
reviewers. There's such an open platform to anyone to talk about this. And I really want to know if, there's a danger. I mean, on the one hand, it's great that we all can share our opinions. But on the other hand, are we losing out by not having more educated people talking?
Well, I wouldn't. That's an interesting question. I wouldn't put it in terms of education. I might actually put it in terms of money. Okay, because we have a much wider range of voices out now online than we ever had before, in terms of talking about movies and pop music and things like that. But we also, less of those people are actually getting paid, and so they have to do it as amateurs. They can. I mean, it used to be that I'm not talking about academia here, but things like journalism. They're like really brilliant film reviewers who have worked for various newspapers, journals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of those jobs have disappeared as media have changed, and
Mm-hmm.
and they laid off people that are paying because they figured they could get somebody else to do it for free online. And so there's a real
Mm-hmm.
problem which people, I mean, some people are managing, but they have to kind of hustle a lot more. I mean, I know
And it,
several
yeah.
people who through Patreon or whatever, I actually pay every month, not much, like a few dollars, just to support writers I really like, so they can talk about whatever various culture things. But it's
Mm-hmm.
still not as, I mean, money is, you have to hustle much more. It's much
Mm-hmm.
harder. There are less jobs open, which will be well paying. All these people used to write for the Village Voice in New York, and they all got fired because now, and the Village Voice eventually closed down too. But you know, there's a difference when you find yourself having to just put up your stuff for love online, which is great, except when you need to get paid, and a day
Mm-hmm.
job can interfere with that, with your ability to write that kind of stuff.
Well, on Patreon, the only one I've been tempted to pay for is Bret Easton Ellis's podcast.
Yeah,
And
I haven't. Go ahead.
I was just going to say what I like about it is he interviews people, but sometimes he just talks on a subject by himself. And what I really like, instead of rambling, he seems like he has everything scripted, although it's not a forced delivery. Like
Yeah.
it's to hear someone who's really taken time to write a well thought out essay.
I have mixed feelings about. I haven't heard his podcast. I have mixed feelings about him because I think he's really smart, and I think his novels are really good and underrated. But he's also seems to become kind of an asshole in recent years, can I say? And that disappoints me.
Oh dear, oh boy. You
But I mean,
see,
I shouldn't be saying things like this in public. But I mean, he's somebody whose fiction I greatly admire. But I'm kind of,
Mhm.
I don't know.
well, he's got very strong opinions.
Yeah.
At least with someone like that, at least if someone's not being wishy-washy, they just come out and they're just very, blatant about where they stand. At least you can love it or hate it.
Yeah. Well, I said I
But
used to love it, but now I'm more hating it. At least some of the stuff.
oh my goodness. Well, who knows? But
Yeah.
I hear what you say about the paying, because I think what happens now, a lot of people, I think, trust the average person who's just leaving their own review, say on IMDb or Amazon, because
Yeah.
they think, oh, this is a person just like me. I'm going to take their recommendation over a paid reviewer who might have, a corporate interest to give it a thumbs up.
Well, there's some truth to that, but there's also problems, which is like gaming the system. It's like these right-wing talk show, you know, hosts who, this happened to actual friends of mine that they wrote something sort of left-leaning on Twitter, and they start getting thousands of, death threats and shit like that. I mean, it's really
Yeah.
atrocious the way,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I don't know. It very, I earn my living as a professor, so there's a continuity between what I'd write as part of what's expected of me for research and stuff which I just put online, like on my blog or something like that. But I don't know. I do a lot. Spend a lot of time reading science fiction novels, and I sometimes
Mhm.
write about them and put it. I'll say it gratifies me when the author of the novel says, "Yeah, this is a thank you for this review. You got what I was trying to do," and upsets me when
Mhm.
the science fiction writer says, "Who is this person? They don't understand me at all." And both have happened to me, so I don't know.
Mhm. I was reading in an interview with you, you said something to the effect, and I'm paraphrasing, that the reviewer should somehow like reflect the creator's intent.
I'm not sure. I'd say I don't know what reviewer try. I wouldn't. I mean, there are often things in works which the creator might not have even. I mean, this happens to me in my writings. Even American people say, "Oh, Shaviro said blah blah blah," and I said, "What? I didn't realize I was saying that." But very often, oh, cool. I think when you create something, I mean, this applies for me even for just like critical writing, but I think it's all the more true for creator that more comes out than you put into it if it really works, and
Mhm.
you find out stuff comes out which you might not have intended to begin with. I
Mhm.
mean, there are different. Some artists are much more conscious of what they're doing, and some are much less so. So it varies. But I don't know. People like I people when I've on the rare occasions I got to talk to them, people like science fiction authors and music video directors are almost always really interesting people to talk to, not just about their own work, but in general. So
Mhm.
because I think they're creative people, but again, it varies from case to case.
Now, do you remember what year Wes Craven's movie Scream came out? Was that
Sometime in the 90s,
96?
mid 90s, I'd say. I don't remember exactly, but yeah.
So to me, that was the turning point, not just for, critiquing horror movies, but a lot of pop culture in general.
Yeah.
It was the whole, idea of the self-aware movie, the characters in the movie being aware of the conventions of that genre.
Yeah.
And I think it's when people started using this word, which for some reason I have such an aversion to. It's trope. Before
Yeah.
then, nobody talked about tropes. That was something that
Yeah.
leave that, to
Well,
the
literary
the
scholars talk about
scholars.
tropes. Yeah.
Yeah, literary tropes, but now everyone thinks, they're an expert, because they use the word trope, or oh, I discovered a trope. Well, that's a
Hmm.
starting point, but
Yeah.
I think it kind of got to a point where it was really clever in Scream. I mean, it was a very clever screenplay, but then it affected horror movies in general after that, not just
Yeah.
that they were making fun of the genre, but that there was this self awareness to it, which I think
Yeah.
took away some of the charm.
Well, I have actually have theory. I've thought about this a lot. Have some theories about it. So, one is that, yeah, when you see like an old thing, which is really, the classic example is Ed Wood, Plan 9 from Outer Space, and Glen or Glenda, where this poor guy was really just trying his best, but he was kind of had no resources and was kind of nuts. And so this stuff comes out as totally weird and wonderful. But when people deliberately try to say, I'm going to make a film like that, which is so bad it's good and which has all these weird things, the very fact that they're calculating it and they're not doing it naively often makes it not quite as good. So
Hmm.
that's one thing. But the other thing is that there are different degrees of self-consciousness. I mean, since you mentioned Scream, I mean, I'm interested in there's lots of, I mean, slasher films are very interesting. I had a graduate student of mine wrote a great dissertation about sort of queer figures in slasher films, which I can't summarize, but he just saw all these films, including very obscure ones, and had really smart things to say about them. But anyway, if you look at the history of slasher films, I mean, it, in a certain sense, it's like invented by Alfred Hitchcock in Psycho. Okay, I mean, he really invented a whole new genre. It took a while for people to imitate that, but then, what really consolidated the slasher film and made it into a big money genre was, and this is like almost 15 or 20 years after Psycho, was Halloween, John Carpenter's first Halloween film. And then that was so successful and stirred, made money at the box office and stirred people's imaginations that they had all kinds of sequels and imitations. So you had Halloween sequels, you had other masked killers like, I'm not even remembering the names of all the movies. You had all these things, and there was a whole cycle of them. And some people just did lame versions of them. Some people actually tried to do clever and subversive things with them. But again, you're right. After a while, the market becomes so saturated, it becomes self-conscious, and you can't do it naively anymore. And so that's when you get in the mid '90s when Wes Craven, the Scream series, and there are other films imitating that as well as sequels. And that's, where you have a kind of tongue-in-cheek postmodern attitude that, okay, here's a scary horror film with a slasher, but also everybody in the movie knows that they're in a scary horror film with a slasher, or knows how these movies work. So I think you're right. I mean, there's some really good movies, like First Scream is really good. There's some other really good movies like that, but there's a danger that becoming so self-aware and self-conscious can hurt them. But that's not the last stage. I mean, what happens is that finally, after a while, even that gets worn out, and you have to figure out what to do next. Since now, not only can't you make a straight slasher film anymore, you can't even make a tongue-in-cheek slasher film anymore because it's been done too many times. And so I think some of the most interesting films, more or less in that genre, in the past decade, have rethought and said, what do we do next? Now we can't just be so self-aware and self-conscious. What else can we do? Okay, so there's several films in the past decade or so which I think have tried to think about that question. One is Cabin in the Woods. Probably the most famous one is Cabin in the Woods, which, again, it's like self-conscious in this way, but it's on a meta level because it turns out these teenagers are just going to the cabin for a weekend and they're being manipulated in all kinds of sneaky ways by these scientists who are going to have them get into a horror situation. They'll be killed to appease the elder gods or whatever. And it even has a choose your own adventure. They go down to the basement and there are all these 20 or 30 different things, and which one they choose will tell which subgenre of horror it is and stuff like that. And then, you have things like the one girl who, as far as the end, is the final girl, isn't a virgin because no kids these age are anymore, but she's like relatively close to it because she hasn't been doing, the kind of slutty stuff other kids have been doing and stuff. And, and so you all have this kind of hyper self, so you have that transmutes into something else. A second example is Unfriended, which now itself has been imitated too many times. But Unfriended, the first Unfriended, which was like 2014, it's not only all about the internet, it all takes place on a Macintosh screen. So if you watch the movie yourself on your own laptop, you're watching a movie where the movie screen becomes a laptop and where you see all the apps you're used to and clicking on these different things, and it's still ultimately a slasher film behind that. So that's another way of doing it. And then a third one, which is less well known, but is actually my favorite. I mean, I should ask you, have you ever seen this film? It's called Detention, directed by Joseph Kahn, who's mostly known as a music video director, from 2011.
No, but I'm going to put it on my to-watch list.
It's, for me, it's one of the most important films of the 21st century. I know that's extravagant, but what is it? It's a mashup of like 25 different genres. It's a teen high school comedy. It's also a teen emo high school thing, like Breakfast Club. It's also a slasher film. It's also a parody of a slasher film. It's also, then there are elements of everything from The Fly to Freaky Friday just thrown in just, to make sure it's as stuffed as possible. And it's this whole film where, it sort of says, well, any genre you do is already too familiar. So you sort of do this incredible hyper mashup of all the genres which you kind of comment on themselves in these multiple ways. I don't know how to
Well,
else
does that
describe it.
speak to how technology has changed people's artistic mindset? If you have the technology to sample music for a
Yes.
generation
Well, I
and
mean, it also,
cut and paste.
well, yeah, Detention is also a time travel film among the many multiple genres, and so it used a joke which is subsequently used in several other slasher movies, which is somebody comes from the present back to like the 1990s, but they have their cell phone with them, but it won't work because they can't get a signal in 1995. And other people get in and say, "Oh, this is a phone. This is not on a phone. It's a computer. Can do all these things." And I'm like, "Come on, don't be ridiculous. Nothing like that can exist. Computers are these gigantic things." So, I mean, that's just
It,
one thing.
sound, it sounds fun. See, the thing is, I like that you like that because that shows you're trying to embrace the new. And I think I'm guilty of sometimes, even though, I'm just a few years younger than you, I'm kind of stuck, in an era where I think, oh, this is my favorite, and I'm not as open to new things like that.
Well,
So,
there nobody's completely open. I mean, it's always as you get older, it always gets harder. I just encourage, more openness. I'm sure there are things which younger people like, which I convinced are great. There are other things younger people love, which I just don't see it. I mean, I don't know. Why are they into? I mean, I have, I'm enough of an, old geezer that I say, "Oh, kids today," I mean, I can't. I try to avoid that, but there's some things
mhm,
I just don't get. So obviously,
mhm.
it's all a matter of degree.
Well, if you like horror, it's easy to get stuck with, oh, I love Freddy Krueger and I love Jason, and
Hmm.
not being open to what are the new monsters. But that brings me to something about horror and genre films in general.
Yeah.
I like when people push the genre, but to me, the whole purpose of a genre is to give your audience the elements that they love. And if you get too arty and don't give them those elements just to show how clever you are, you've kind of cheated them because at that point, then why even say that's a horror movie
Hmm.
if you're so far away from what your fans want?
Well, I'm with you in part on that, but I think I mean, this is something I always talk about to my film students about genre. It goes both ways because on the one hand, if you if you're expecting a genre and it's something totally different, you're talking about ultra arty films, but I mean, if you really want to see a horror film and it's a kind of light, frothy rom-com, you'll probably be pissed off. And the inverse is true. If you really want to see a light, frothy rom-com and instead it's a really gory, disgusting horror film, you'll probably be upset also. But the other thing works. I mean, you can go to a movie and say, "Shit, I've just seen this so many times before. It's not doing anything new. It's just going through the same formula." So I
Hmm.
think and this is for the whole history of the film genres in the 20th century into the 21st, the question is always, how do I get a balance between giving these familiar things and on the one hand, and the other hand, doing something new with it so that giving it another twist, giving it something clever or different so that people won't just feel, oh, I'm seeing the same old stuff all over again. And
Hmm.
that's difficult, but it's a balance that goes in both directions. And that's what the trick really is. And the thing when I'm delighted by new films and stuff like that, it's partly because, I mean, I don't make films, partly because I could never think of stuff like that. But when I see something where somebody adhered to the genre, but also got a really smart and interesting and weird new twist, which I never would have thought of on my own, I say that's what I love. You know, so
Hmm.
it's a balance between the two directions that's important for me.
Well, I think horror films have always tackled, you know, um, cultural issues,
Yeah,
sometimes very subtly, but sometimes more overtly. I think today it's being more overtly, but I think, the current crop
yeah.
of filmmakers have to realize, well, you may be wearing that more on your sleeve, but they've always done that. You're just kind of
Hmm.
leading with that.
Yeah, well, again, it's a matter of degree. I mean, to think of, um, some films do it more, some films do it less. I mean, I mean, I'm trying to think of examples which are my mind's blanking on it at the moment. But there again, I see that as really a matter of degree. Like Jordan Peele, yeah, that's an example. I mean, Get Out was very upfront with its politics, and it was a totally
Hmm.
great film. His next film, Us, is a bit more subtle, because it's creepy. It's not it's about a black family and a white family, but it's not exclusively about race in the same way that Get Out was. But it's
Hmm.
still very creepy and works really well, and it's still addressing some of the same issues, many of the same issues. So I think,
Right.
again, interesting creators are always negotiating these things back and forth, is what I'd say.
Well, I think another interesting example is the recent Invisible Man, which had,
Yeah,
a very
I
much.
haven't still haven't seen it, but yeah.
Okay. Well, the
But
big
go ahead
theme is,
anyway.
well, it's about, an abusive relationship and a woman, fleeing that, and then a man using this technology to torment her.
Yeah,
And the thing about that is, horrors, in many, classic horror films have, used the theme of, a woman being
yeah.
treated badly by a man. But this one, I think, it did it in a way that was topical because it talks about,
Hmm.
sort of narcissistic abuse and
Yeah,
gaslighting, and which
yeah.
I think was a really fresh way to do it. And the purists say, well, this was never in, H.G. Wells' book. But the whole point is, a movie that's been remade that many times, of course you can freshen it up for a modern audience.
Well, that's what I was saying before. I said there's a continuum between familiarity and innovation. If you go too far in either direction, it'll turn people off. But if you hit a sweet spot, it has enough familiarity to hook you in, but it doesn't have so much that you say, "Oh, this is just the same old stuff all over again."
Right. Whereas I think a lot of, purists, they see a movie like Friday the 13th and think, oh, that's stripped of all politics. That's just a pure bloodfest. And maybe it is, but even that had its own thing at the time of, the virgin surviving to the end, the
Yeah,
kids who have sex die early. It's still making a moral judgment.
yeah. Well, again, I think a lot of movies, I mean, they're also cycles. I mean, in the early 2000s, there was the Saw films
Hmm.
and the Hostel films, which were really kind of gross. I mean, they really just had explicit, disgusting things on screen. And then you sort of had to move away from that to things like Paranormal Activity, which is one series now concluded, but I've seen all six of them, and I love the whole series, Paranormal Activity, in which, it's the opposite. It's almost nothing happens, and you get almost hypnotically waiting for something to happen, and and the dread of waiting because you know something's going to happen, you don't know when or where or what, is what makes them really work.
It's interesting you say that. So, what else do you like about them? Because it's definitely not about the art direction or the clever
Well, it's
camera movement.
but I mean it is in a certain way because the other thing, I mean, I published an article about the Paranormal Activity films. One of the
Mhm.
things that they're doing, which is really I think is really great, is that the technology used to make the movie is the same as the technology depicted within the movie.
Mhm.
And so, like the first one has people, webcams on laptops. The second one, the guy puts in surveillance cams all around the house. The third one is a prequel. It goes back to a year earlier, so it's all VHS. The fourth one then has, Microsoft Kinect and stuff like that. So, I mean, and in each case, it's really, I mean, we have a story which is given to us in skeletal forms about these demons and a past, but the demons are really inhabiting the technology.
Mhm.
I mean, and it's sort of like, you know, you just, and there's sequences in some of those films where you see it's middle of the night, you're just waiting for something to happen, and there's like five cameras, and you go sequence 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, back to 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, or the camera's going back and forth. I mean, there's in the third one, which is VHS, the guy takes that rotating fan and puts the VHS camera on the fan so it goes back and forth. And so it's almost like an avant-garde formalist film in terms of it just sort of at a fixed rate going back and forth. When this side it shows the living room, this side shows the kitchen. But that's used as a setup for these totally shocking things to happen at certain moments, and it's brilliant.
It sort of puts you in that fight or flight mode.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, so I think those films are brilliant both because they're masterfully used the whole thing of having to wait, which is, I mean, there's always been different modes of horror, shocking you with what you see and shocking you with what you can't see and what you might hear, what you might vaguely know, and what you have to wait for it because you know it's going to come. And, and it combines that with this, brilliant comment on the technology it's using.
I like how you mentioned that it's shot in the format that it's portraying, the
Yeah.
video surveillance. One thing that always brings me out of a movie, nice movie shot on film, and then there's a scene where they're watching a video someone took, And when they play that video, they're showing it, like they really shot it on VHS and they're using
Hmm.
that in the movie. And it's kind of like they don't realize they've already established a film world, with that resolution. So
Yeah.
within that world, it doesn't look realistic, even though that it's supposed to be a VHS tape. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, I don't know that those things tend. I mean, I guess I like those better than you do. A lot of those things actually do tend to work for me,
Hmm.
and sometimes, I mean, I
They
think
don't take you
it's
out of the trance.
no, they sort of make me more kind of. Oh, I mean, this again. I have a theory about this, and when I teach, I often give my students a whole kind of timeline of media because everybody takes for granted what they grew up with, and it's hard to realize something. So, I mean, I tell my students, I give them a history of media going back to photography and telegraph in the 1830s up to, the phonograph, Edison's phonograph, and then first movies, 1895, and so on. Introduction of sound, introduction, of television, introduction of color, introduction of the internet. But I mean, the way I vividly show it to my students is, okay, so my mother was born in 1927, the exact same year when they first added sound to movies. I was born in 1954, and that was the same year that my parents bought their first television set. TV existed since the late 40s, but the mid 50s,
Hmm.
around when I was born, is when it became in everybody's household in
Hmm.
America. And my kids were born, into a world where everybody used the internet all the time, and so they were, using the internet when they were 3 years old. So,
So those
uh,
are landmarks. And then
yeah.
81 MTV came about. And then
Well,
what was it, like 91 or 92 when AOL home internet hit?
yes. I mean, there were all these things, and I mean, there are other things. I mean, I remember the first time I saw an ATM, a cash machine.
Oh, yeah.
I lived in a world where you had to go to the bank to get your money out, during banking hours.
Do you
So,
remember when you saw your first scanner at a grocery store?
no, I don't, but I know that they didn't exist in the old days, but I don't know when I saw the first one. I don't remember that.
Probably late 70s, maybe?
That makes sense to me.
Mhm.
But anyway, just to be aware that, I mean, and people very often tend to think anything they grew up with from their kids existed forever, and anything which was introduced when they were adults were like newfangled inventions. But this is a history which is ever since. I mean, it started with electronic inventions in the early 19th century, and it's just
Mhm.
accelerated ever since.
Well, along those lines, there was something that's kind of the buzzword a few years back, especially when YouTube came and people started telling stories in web series, and they were thinking, oh, there's
Yeah,
a whole new format. And I think at one point it was like new media or transmedia were
yeah,
saying, hey, we'll have a movie, but we'll do a crossover and do a mini YouTube series that's
yeah.
related. But do you remember when Marble Hornets was the buzz?
No, I don't remember that one.
Because that was a made for YouTube series and it basically has a big cult following. And it was about these young filmmakers who are making a film. And you see kind of, this parts of the making the film, but the other
Yeah,
part of the story is someone gets all those old tapes after the fact of the
yeah,
filmmaker. So it's kind of like someone watching someone else's tapes and then they're discovering these weird clues and
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
spooky things within. And I kind of resisted it, maybe because, now I'm too old for that. Maybe I wasn't the right
Yeah.
demographic, but
Hmm.
I said, okay, I'm going to watch it with an open mind. And you know what? It had some effective moments. And I believe this was either high 8 or regular VHS.
Yeah.
But I think that also came hand in hand with maybe 10 or so years ago when the new generation was embracing the flaws and the glitches of
Yeah.
VHS.
Yeah, sure. But again, I mean, again, I mean, the history of technology changing both means sometimes old technologies are superseded and because by the newer ones, but also sometimes people realize, oh, you can do something interesting by going back to the old one. I mean, when I teach film classes, a lot of the students complain about the older films being in black and white instead of color. And
Mhm.
what I try to point out is that, with either black and white and color, I mean, now very few films are in black and white. It's always for a very specific artistic purpose. But, if you look at any film, you have to ask, how are they using the black and white if it was from the black and white days? And how are they using the color if it's a more recent film? And
Mhm.
that's always really can be used in different ways.
Well, let's talk about venue, because I know when the Paranormal Activity movie came out, they had these ads on TV showing just the audience's
Yeah,
reaction to the movie,
yeah,
which was great. But now, if you think of, okay, people watching on their laptops, people watching on their
yeah,
phone, but if you're, watching it on your phone late at night in the dark, that's one
mm,
thing. But if you're
yeah,
doing it on the bus or, with people around, much different. And I think it was so great when we just were able to watch something in a theater with no distractions. We're not checking our
yeah,
phone during it. But I also think we've also missed out on the drive-in movie theater, which was a great place to see
yeah.
slasher movies. And then
Hmm.
even the grindhouses or just the rundown kind of scary theaters where you felt like
Yeah.
anything could happen there.
Well, I mean, all I can say is that these things, again, when technology, I mean, again, since I do a lot of this sort of film history of Hollywood, Hollywood went into a crisis in the 1950s, and there are many reasons, but one of the reasons was that, people went to the movies a lot more before television was existed. And, you'd go to the movies on Saturday and you'd have a whole series. You have an A picture, a B picture, you'd have cartoons, you'd have, serials, which you episode every week. You'd have newsreels, all that kind of stuff. And obviously, a lot of that stopped because people could get a lot of that on TV. So, I mean, I know I always feel, yeah, I mean, wistful about older forms when they were enjoyable, but I always try to think, what are the new possibilities? I mean,
Well, back in the day, the dream was, cable with 100 channels. Now it's, beyond just Netflix, which is kind of its own, hundreds of channels. Every,
yeah.
category has so many movies.
Well, I, there's, I mean, again, a lot of this is tied up. I keep on saying this, but it's tied up with economics. How much does it cost? I mean, lots of people download movies illicitly for free, and but then on the other hand, I have a Netflix subscription, I have an Amazon Prime subscription, I have an HBO Max subscription, I have a Disney. I guess my daughter got a Disney subscription. I mean, they're just and then each one's another like $10 or $15 you have to pay every month, and so it gets. But I mean, that's why I got rid of cable, because I used to have cable, but
Mhm.
by 150 channels it was way too expensive, and I realized 90% of this I can get online. So I got rid of the
Mhm.
cable, but now I watch everything online. But now they're starting to charge for more things online, which you used to be able to see just for your general thing.
Do
So,
you think people value this content as much since it's so plentiful?
well, there's always been that problem. And I think, again, it may be boring to say that, but I think it goes both ways. I understand people say, well, when it's harder to see something, you'd value it more because it was so hard to get to see it. And yeah, that's kind of true, but there are other things where it's really good that you can actually, it's sort of like with music or I mean, music videos is a good example because, I mean, that's something I've been writing about and studying. But like music videos, I remember when MTV came on in 1981 and I started watching it. But so, there's a whole thing with music videos where you might want to see a certain video you'd heard something about, but you'd have to like watch for 3 hours until they actually played it and stuff.
Hmm.
And, and then MTV and other stations stopped playing as much music videos. Instead of being on any time, they'd be only on certain programs, certain hours, and it'd be hard to see. And then for a while, they were actually putting out music videos on DVDs. And then 2005 is when YouTube started. And so for the last 15 years, everything's available there. And in a way, in a way you might not, I won't see random things, which I did because I had to just watch MTV until what I want to see came on. So I'd see these other things. But on the other hand, it's great that if I want to see so and so's new video, I can just see it. I don't have to wait for 5 hours for it to show up or something like that.
Hmm.
So
Well,
there are pluses and minuses to all these changes.
hmm well, before we wrap up, and we do have a little more to talk about, I want to wrap up with some
Yeah.
talk about exploitation film and how Hollywood has totally appropriated every last bit of the
Hmm.
fun, trashy movies that we used to cherish. Not always in a bad way,
Yeah.
but want to talk a little bit about your love of music videos and how you're teaching it and how you wrote about that in one of your last books.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Music videos are just a really interesting art form for various reasons. And it's also one which oddly seems to be understudied in academia, even though academia is open to popular culture in so many different ways. And okay, why is I mean, there are various reasons. One, there's the history. I mean, you can go into the prehistory of clips on TV and video jukeboxes, and you have MTV in 1981. Then you have, you know, the change in format from being on TV to being on the internet, which we have had since, as I said, since 2005. You've also had changes in technology from shooting them on film to shooting them on video. But you also have the fact that music videos, part of what I love about music videos is they're often very impure. Like they have so many, if you're making a music video and you're a music video director, you have to consider what the musical artist needs. You also might have to consider what the record company wants, which will be different from what the artists themselves want. You also have to consider, product placement to help finance it. I mean, there are all these different things pulling, and then a lot of music videos are meta commentary. So you have music videos which sort of recreate scenes from beloved old movies, or you have music videos which which have fashion designers and use new high fashion, or you have music videos which parody television commercials or whatever. I mean, it's just there's like so much going on. It's kind of dizzying, and I think that's kind of great. And then also, I mean, it's not true that all music videos are. They talk about MTV editing, this really rapid editing style, but music videos actually, in a way, they're more interesting than when the same rapid editing style is used in like action movies, because the action movies, they have to worry about telling a story, and some music videos tell stories. They often don't have to worry about telling a story, so you can do other things. You can, I mean, music itself, the lyrics might tell a story, or they might just express a mood. Music usually has different passages, like there's a verse and chorus, and there's another chorus, verse, another chorus, and there's a bridge, and there's a return to the final chorus. And you can do visual things which relate to that in kind of interesting ways. In a movie, you'd feel confused if you saw the same character in different clothes, back and forth among different shots. But in music videos, we take it for granted that the artist might be wearing 5 different costumes in 5 different locations, and you keep on switching back and forth between them. It's nonlinear in a really interesting way, which has to do with the way that music is nonlinear, because we have choruses and verses and repetitions and transformations and all that kind of stuff. So there's just a lot of beautiful stuff going on in music videos, and it expresses lots of moods. And I don't know, I mean, really hardcore music people don't like videos because they say you should listen to the music as music. And I understand that, but I don't have much musical training, and I really don't know. Part of the reason I started writing music videos is because I didn't know how to write about pop music. But since I know about movies, I can write about music videos and be writing about the pop music, but also writing about cinematic aspects. And so again, it's messy and combines a lot of different things, and that's what's great about it.
Now, I think even before you wrote that, in your book, Post-Cinematic Effect, which came out in 2010, was that the book where you wrote about Grace Jones?
Yes.
And what was it, Corporate Cannibal?
Yeah, I wrote about that video. But I mean, even before that, I was publishing, there are articles which I publish in academic journals or online, which aren't necessarily in my books. I mean, I started writing about my first 2 music video articles. There was one about Bjork, and there was one about Missy Elliott. And then I just went on to write about other, music video things. So I have besides that whole book, I have lots of articles about different music videos, which I've published in different places.
Do you think people underestimate the impact of music videos? Because one thing YouTube does that we couldn't do back in the 80s, I mean, there's hit counters, and when you see a video that's had 1 billion or more views, that's some major impact.
No, I mean, well, there's that, and there's also people talking about the videos. I mean, it used to be that again, what made impact was if they were on television, but now it's kind of views on, I mean, there are music videos which have a wide cultural. There are videos which are just, which are just music videos, and fans of the music watch them. But there are other music videos which have wide, cultural and social impacts. I mean, most recently, WAP or WAP,
Cardi B
and Megan Thee Stallion, everybody was talking about it, and it's, making it, it's doing stuff. I mean, it's very sexual. It's very much saying women can flaunt sex. It's not just a guy thing, and we can do it for ourselves, but I mean, then before that, like This Is America, a couple of years ago, Childish Gambino was a big thing. Everybody was talking about it again because it had a major cultural impact and major commentary. So there are things like that. I mean, there are also, I don't know, some of the stuff Beyonce does. Beyonce has a major impact whenever she does anything, though she usually keeps her things on the last video movie with all the songs in the album made videos was on Disney, and the one before was also on the streaming services. But nonetheless, so there are artists who make impacts, big public impacts, and so that's another thing. They're also, I mean, there are a lot of musicians who got attention from me and from other people first because of their videos, and though their music is really interesting in itself, sort of doing these interesting videos at the same time really were kind of challenging and thought-provoking, even if they weren't mass popular. I think of somebody like F.K. Twigs as an example of that, for instance.
What do you think of the film directors who got their start in music videos? Do you think they work well because they learn visual storytelling through that?
Well, it's not partly, I mean, a lot of music video directors, when I've read interviews with them, or in a few cases when I actually got to interview them, they all want to, do feature films and stuff like that as well, which is understandable because it's working on a much bigger canvas, a bigger scale. But some of them, there's some people like David Fincher who started out making videos for Madonna and other big artists, and when
Right.
he's now one of America's, most famous film directors, and he hasn't done music videos in a long time. But then there's other people like Michel Gondry, who started out in the 80s and 90s making incredible music videos, then became a big Hollywood director, but he still makes music videos now and again when it's a friend of his or when he feels in the mood or whatever. And I like when they keep their hands in it. They're among younger generations. I mentioned that film Detention by Joseph Kahn. Joseph Kahn basically makes music video directors. He's worked with big names, everybody from Eminem to Britney Spears to Taylor Swift. But he made one movie in Hollywood and it was an unhappy experience, so he decided to only make movies when he could pay for it himself. And
Oh, wow.
so he worked for he's only made 2 movies in the last decade, but in each case he worked for 5 years making as many music videos and TV commercials as he could, and then use the profits to self-fund a movie so he'd have final cut and stuff like that. And then there are other people who do projects, and some are more successful, some are, Hype Williams is one of the best music video directors for the last 20-25 years. He made one movie, Belly, which came out about 1998 or 99, and it's actually a really interesting movie, but it didn't do well in the box office, so he went back to making videos because he was having trouble getting funding with more movies. So, I mean, it really varies, but I think there is interesting interplay. I mean, part of the thing about music videos is that because you don't have to tell a story in the same way, you don't have to worry about continuity editing in the same way, and that liberates you to do all kinds of weirder things visually, I think.
I'm thinking of this one director who's very prolific. He did like Lady Gaga, I think Telephone, and Madonna's Ray of Light. Yes, and he is so visually stunning and is so successful. But he finally directed a movie. He did the adaptation of the book Lords of Chaos about, I think, the Norwegian death metal or black metal. And you know what? I have very mixed feelings. I mean, I wouldn't throw it out, totally. But I thought for someone who was so visually stunning in his music videos, this movie really didn't leave, didn't have much impact for me.
That sometimes happens, that they just they feel that because they're telling a story, they have to play it more straight. I mean, Edgar Lund actually made 3 or 4 movies. I haven't seen all of them, but he made one good movie. It's called Sprung, I think. It's just this hilarious satiric movie about a speed addict.
Okay.
Messed up his whole life because he's an addict, but it's like deadpan, but it's really hilarious, and that was pretty good. But yeah, a lot of he's another example of somebody who seems to do better in the short form and hasn't been as successful in longer films. And there are other examples of that. I think a lot of it again has to do that they feel they need to play it straight, so they kind of clamp down on their wild visual imagination so the movie be coherent. I mean, it's sort of like it's a 5-minute video. It doesn't have to be coherent in those terms because the music and the artists being in the whole thing make it coherent. But when you have a 2-hour, an hour-and-a-half movie, then you have to worry about a lot more, and that sort of cripples what you can do visually and stuff.
We could also argue Madonna does the same thing for herself. She's very effective in a 3-minute music video. Really struggles sustaining a whole movie as an actress.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's true. Again, I don't know. It's the question of when she's in a movie, how much power does she have? I mean, in a music video, I mean, I'm very interested in music video directors who do really smart, interesting, good stuff, and for different musicians. But you know, you can't just, it's rare that you just make a music video the musician doesn't want. So there's always, there's always collaborative, and I like collaboration. I think it often brings out things which one individual might not have gotten by themselves.
Well, before we dive into exploitation or the death of exploitation, I just want you to give a brief rundown. You were in Seattle in the late 80s, early 90s, when a big cultural revolution was going on, with the grunge music scene. And you were kind of, at the epicenter, the University District, and there was Capitol Hill and downtown. But, that was kind of like the world was looking at us at that time. And I just want to know, what you felt at that time and what your experiences were.
Kind of, I wasn't at the center because I didn't know the band people or the people really centrally involved. But I was certainly went to a lot of concerts and I was an observer of it. And I don't know. I get the impression that a lot of the grunge musicians themselves were kind of puzzled. Like, why, we're doing this stuff because we like it. And all of a sudden, we're wearing flannel shirts because that's kind of the stuff we're selling. All of a sudden, they're selling $300 flannel shirts at big department stores to key into this. There was also, I don't know, it was weird. I kept on seeing all these journalists would come to Seattle and I'd see the articles and a lot of them were, really ridiculous from the point of view of somebody actually lived there. You'd read I can't remember, some French journal had this big article called Latitude, fuck you. And, you read the article was you couldn't walk down Broadway and Capitol Hill without being accosted every 3 steps by somebody who wanted to force you to buy heroin from them or something like that. It was just ridiculous.
Did they offer you? Because I never was approached by drug dealers.
No, I was
kind of offended.
Neither was I. It was ridiculous. It was ridiculous. But it was this kind of, world-treading people. Oh, here's the next scene. A little bit. I've been in Detroit now since 2004, and Detroit it wasn't anything as big as the Seattle grunge scene, but Detroit has also been, rebuilding after all the ruins, and so it's gotten a certain amount of what we call ruin porn and stuff. And we had for a while, international journalists coming here also. So I feel like I lived through something like that in Seattle and again in Detroit. And often it doesn't have very accurate. It's very sensation of what it's actually like to live in the city you're in. So I don't know.
Well, I just remember in the U District, one day I'm looking at my Alice in Chains CD, and in the back they've got a little address for their fan club.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at it, it's like a P.O. box thing, but it wasn't like the post office. It was like a private mailbox service. I look at it, like, oh my God, that's just around the corner from me.
Yeah.
To me, they felt, things felt that accessible.
I've always one of the things I've always kicked myself for is that there was Nirvana was having a concert at Seattle Center, and I was thinking, should I buy a ticket? And I said, and I think, well, Seattle Center is they're too famous now. Seattle Center is too big. There's 2,000 people there. It wouldn't be good seeing a less known group in a club. So I didn't buy a ticket. And that turned out to be the last concert they ever performed before Kurt Cobain killed himself. So I, really lamented that I didn't go. But
wow.
What did you do?
Yeah. I think I like it more after the fact, when all this was going on. I just didn't go out to, live music in general, but I had a friend who loved the scene and his wife didn't want to go to these concerts with him. So he said, hey, do you want to go? And it's only because he, dragged me to these that I got to go to the Crocodile Cafe back in the day. And he was a big Posies fan. Mm-hmm. But I'd see, whoever was playing with them, Gas Huffer and, but we go to Rock Candy. Do you remember Under the Rail? It was under the monorail.
I vaguely remember that one. Yeah, I remember that one.
And when you look around now, these places are gone. Under the Rail's gone. Rock Candy's gone.
Well, that's gentrification. I don't live in. It's been a long time since I lived in Seattle, but I read all these things about how outrageous rents are right now.
Oh yeah. One thing I hope is still there. And I'd have to check, but remember Bulldog News on the Ave?
Yeah, I remember that very well.
Because did you read zines? Did you read funky film journals and stuff like that back in the day?
Some of them, not that regularly, but I'd occasionally pick them up, and so it's
Do you remember one called, I think it was Jump Cut?
Yeah, I
I
remember
think
that
they had
title.
that there. Remember the first time I picked up something like that? And that's when I think I first read somebody analyze a music video in a very scholarly way.
Hmm. Well, again, it's
Although,
it's
I was
surprising how little of it there, how little. I mean, there's a lot of when something says something culturally, like about like some Rihanna videos or Beyonce videos or Childish Gambino videos or WAP with Cardi B this year. I mean, you get a lot of analysis, but a lot of people don't analyze. I mean, there's a lot less. And when in film departments, I mean, a lot of people talk about mainstream films, a lot of people talk about underground films, a lot of people talk about all kinds of films, but very few of my colleagues across the nation write about music videos. And I mean, there are few of enough of us that I think kind of know all of them, basically.
well, that was neat about the digital music video book you wrote. Wasn't that part of a series that does well-defined subjects?
Yeah, I mean, it's a whole. I wrote it for a whole series. So there's one on Disney movies. There's one on zombie movies. There's on all kinds of different things. But yeah, I
Hmm.
did. I mean, I just basically that one. I mean, I wanted to write music videos. I've been writing articles, but somebody, an acquaintance of mine, a film studies professor, was saying, "Oh, I'm editing this new series. Give me a pitch." And so I pitched the music videos. They said, "Yeah," and so it happened.
The last time I was at SeaTac Airport in Seattle, I discovered they had a Sub Pop record store, and it was pretty cool. Have you been there?
No,
Well,
for a
of
long time.
course, it's a little touristy, but boy, did they have a lot of content. And I don't know if they published this or if they just carried it, but they're almost like little chapbooks, mini books, where
Hmm.
people are just writing about either an artist or like an album,
Yeah.
but just going in depth on that. Like,
Well, no,
one,
there is a bunch. Yeah, I'm sorry. No, go
I was
ahead.
just going to say, yeah, and I love the format that it was just, one person's thought on, almost this album that affected them so much.
Yeah, no, there's a whole. Well, there's several series. There's one series called 33 and a Third. Which is the old record
Okay.
interpretation speed old vinyl records, and there's like 50 or 60 books now, and each one is just on one album by one artist and a different person.
That's probably what I saw. Yeah.
Then there's another one called, Why X Matters, like why Karen Carpenter matters, why the Ramones matter, et cetera, et cetera. And there are a couple of others. I mean, there's been a uptick in publishing of that for music, for pop music, but there's been less of it for music videos than for pop music
Okay.
per se.
Well, maybe that's a need now for the market that maybe they should start doing that too.
Well, I mean, I have I know some people who are editing some kind of academic book series about music videos, and I have a
Mhm.
couple of ideas to pitch them. I haven't done it yet because I'm busy with other things. I've been spending a lot of time writing about
It
science fiction.
still has so much impact like 38 years later.
Yeah,
It's I Ran by a Flock of Seagulls.
yeah,
They're in that room with the mirrors and the two girls with the black trash bag dresses,
yeah. I remember that.
and the camera's kind of moving around the room. Why is that so effective? It's so
I don't
cheap.
know. There's still. I mean, if you when I do my music videos class, which I do every several years at my university, I try to do the whole history, and there's some old ones which are, you can say this is the first one to do X, but it's also some of them are still really good. I mean, the first music video ever showed on MTV when it started broadcasting in 1981 was "Video Killed the Radio Star" by the Buggles.
Hmm.
And it's still, I mean, it's very low tech by today's standards, but it's still a really clever and smart video.
It is. Remember when they show like the tubes?
Yeah, and they have these go-go dancers dancing in test tubes, and the members of the band are wearing these kind of flashy, like Flash Gordon type science fiction costumes and stuff. And they
Well,
also
one
have
cool
they
thing
have a
about, yeah, early MTV would play videos that weren't necessarily top 40 hits.
well, they were very. I mean, they didn't. They made a lot of them. They made them for, and the early MTV was very kind of narrow. Like they really
Hmm.
basically were doing indie rock and British post punk and stuff like that. It took them a few years to start showing hip hop or any other African American music.
Yeah.
And then for a while they were. I mean, they may still exist on cable. They have cable stations where they just play one genre, like
Hmm.
all hair metal videos, 24/7, or all rap videos 24/7 or whatever.
Right. And what was that one MTV Headbangers Ball?
Yeah, there were a couple
It's
of
kind
things like that, but yeah,
Is that kind of hard to think of now because
Well,
Heavy metal really dominated MTV for a while.
I know, but I mean, what's always true is that there's more stuff going on in pop music than gets mainstreamed and publicized. And that was especially true for MTV, that they ignored whole genres and whole, subcultures. And that's one reason why I think it's better that you have, it's all on YouTube now, because there's more access. If somebody tells you about it, you can look up and watch it for yourself. And I mean, there are all these bizarre, like, sub I don't know much about, which I sometimes read about.
Mhm.
And I'll check it out because it's available. I mean,
Do you watch a lot of Rammstein videos?
they're okay. I've never. They aren't. They aren't. They're definitely doing provocative and interesting things. I don't love them. I have to say, as
Mhm.
much as some other people.
What I'm so taken with is the heavy metal bands in the 80s wouldn't touch half the subject matter that Rammstein
Mhm.
does. And
Yeah.
yet, it's so funny how in a couple decades, how, a metal band can be so much more open to different
hmm
types of content in their videos.
Well, that's happened in general. I mean, we have the. Well, I don't know. We have this kind of culture split. I mean, it's like the culture's going one way. I mean, it's like just recently, this wasn't a video per se, though he's done videos, but like, so Harry Styles, appeared as a model in Vogue and wore a dress and one thing, and he got these
Right.
like right-wing talk show or Twitter
Hmm.
people denouncing him for destroying masculinity or something like that. And then you have, other people saying, "Oh, it's great. I'm on the it's great camp myself." But it's like it's weird that you have a culture and you still have people saying denouncing this and like the old line sentence, but then you have a lot of other people who say, oh, you shrug your shoulders, yeah, cool, Harry loves the teenage girls who love him, and he's willing to do all this stuff, and he's kind of cool, and he's ambiguous, sexually fluid, gender fluid, and all that's cool. I mean, that couldn't have happened 30 years ago
Yeah.
in that way.
But I'm sure Vogue welcomes the controversy
Yeah,
because let's face it, print magazines are struggling to stay relevant.
I know, but it's not even that much. I mean, again, it seems like even the controversy. I mean, it seems like they have a big enough audience of people just not even see it as scandalous, just sort of give it shrug of the shoulders. Yeah, that's cool, and it's kind of weird that we have these retro people, usually right wing politically, who are making
Mhm.
a big scandal of it. Like, oh my God, how can you? I mean,
Yeah.
it seems like
Right.
they just seem like they're so out of it to me. But
Right.
obviously there are millions of people who go along with those lines anyway. So who knows?
Yeah, to me, that's such the minor thing. It's like, okay, well, whatever, that's cool.
Yeah,
To me, it's the fact that Vogue has caved into the cult of celebrity and has
yeah.
become just a celebrity publication.
Well, that's when you talk about like exploitation movies now being done in by Hollywood because now they're being done on high budgets, it's the same thing. I mean, everything's it's hard to imagine. I mean, I don't know, everything's amplified and at a higher volume now. Both good things and bad things.
It is. Well, we're going to jump on that into our final stretch, and it's going to start with
Okay.
Tarantino. But first, I just have to give you one more plug. In 1996, you wrote a
Yeah.
book called Doom Patrols, which was named
Yeah.
after, is that a graphic novel or a
It named
comic book
after what it was
series?
it was a comic book series called Doom Patrol, which was
With no S.
complicated. No, I added the S from my book.
You added the S.
The
Yeah.
S wasn't in the original. And I mean, it's like it's an ongoing. It's been ongoing. I was talking about one particular run, which Grant Morrison, who's still 25 years later one of the big names in mainstream comics, had written, where he had sort of gone out on a limb before it became that common for people to go out on limbs. So
Mhm. And what strikes me is it's the one book you did for Serpent's Tail High Risk Imprint. So
yeah.
Serpent's Tail was an English publisher, and then
Well,
High Risk was their
yeah,
American kind of branch for kind of, what was it, more avant-garde work
yeah.
or?
Well, I kind of got screwed over on that. It's a sad story, but
I'm sorry.
no,
I hope I'm not dredging up a
no, no,
bad
no, no, no,
memory
no.
for you.
I'll tell you what happened. It's basically, I was really proud of this book. I wanted to be with a non-academic press. I knew people who knew people, so I got introduced to their very cool editor for their North American branch, even though it's a British company. Got along with him really well. He was really enthusiastic at publishing this series. Literally the same week, so we went through all the production process. Literally the same week that the book actually came out, Serpent's Tail had a major corporate reorganization. They fired my editor and shut down the North American branch. So as a result, they didn't even market.
Wow.
Like, it was advertised in the UK, but it was not even advertised at all in the US even, and so nobody knew about it for a couple of years.
Wow.
So that's what I mean by I got screwed by it, because it was major disappointment because I mean, as I said, the guy who was the editor in chief who they fired was great and had all these ideas of how to get publicity without spending money and stuff like that. But nothing had, it didn't happen.
Wow. So I think it's so cool you're a part of that because back in the 90s, when I was, especially going through the used bookstores or the, university bookstore,
Yeah.
that high risk imprint really stood out. And I was always gravitating because those were like, I just had a hunger for these new
Well, really great.
thinkers.
I mean, Kathy Acker published a book about saying
Kathy Acker. Yeah. And I know you've written about her and you were a big fan of hers.
Kathy Acker. Well, there's a book just came out, which I'm in. Kathy Acker, I think, was a really major, important, brilliant writer, and she had to play the game in terms of fame in order to get anywhere because she was writing these edgy, difficult books, and I think she was a brilliant and great writer. She passed in the late '90s, and she had breast cancer and died at age in her lower 50s. So it's really kind of sad that she couldn't do more. I knew her a bit, so I didn't know her very well, but I met her a couple of times, and we got along great. And I think she's a really important writer. And in recent years, people have been trying to do. There was a book just is coming. I'm actually going to a Zoom, you know, release party for this book called Kathy Acker in Seattle,
Oh,
which she lived in Seattle for 6 months in the early '80s, and then she came to Seattle for like 2 weeks to do stuff at COCA, Center for Contemporary Art, and that's when I met her, and that's when she had a workshop, and she chose one writer from the workshop to young writers who were to do the workshop with to read with her, and the writer she chose was somebody who nobody had heard at the time, Kathleen Hanna, who's since become famous. So now actually I'm in this, I mean, it's a small press book and I don't quite know the distribution, but now I'm in a book with Kathleen Hanna because we both have memoirs of Acker, which has just come out or just about to come out. So
nice. Well, just to name drop a few others to put out something on high risk. I mean, William Burroughs, Diamanda Gallis,
yeah,
Gary Indiana, Cookie
yeah,
Mueller. I love that
those
Cookie
are all great.
Mueller.
Those are all great writers, and
Yeah.
and
But
some
don't we, I
singers like
mean,
Dallas.
nowadays, people blog, and I think we miss out something. There's just something special about compiling someone's thoughts into print.
Well, again, that's one of the things where I feel they're both pluses and minuses. Yeah, a lot of the stuff's become more accessible, though, I mean, and that may make up for the fact that it seems less like a special event. I mean, there are pluses and minuses because on one hand, it seems less special because we're so overwhelmed with so much stuff. On the other hand, certain things, I mean, it's like, I've read articles with this. It's like if there's like a gay teenager in a small town in rural Michigan or something, they have no friends and they have nobody now because that was true 30 years ago. Now because of the internet, they can find communities of people who feel the same way they do and like the same things and have the same
Mhm.
interests and stuff.
Sure.
So it's really helped a lot of people, I think.
Sure, and I love reading a good self-published ebook where, it's someone's story you would never, read from a major publisher. And I love the whole genre of just little kind of personal memoirs, and maybe they're not
Mm-hmm.
famous, but somehow they do have an interesting story to tell.
Well, again, there's much too much stuff to keep track of. So, I mean, part of it is that nobody can say they really follow everything in any particular subgenre or field, let alone in general. But and there's some loss from that, but at the same time, there's
Mhm.
a gain that more things are accessible. So again, I don't think I don't think that new technologies are a great thing or a horrible thing, or it's obviously both. You just have to sort of look at both the pluses and the minuses and figure out ways to negotiate through it.
Well, in these books you've published, have you always worked with an editor?
Yeah, well, I mean, academic presses, which are most of my books, except for Doom Patrols, are all academic presses. There's always an editor, and you go through a process. But I don't know, mine aren't changed for me. I mean, the way I write is that I write slowly, and part of that's because as I'm writing it, I rewrite over and over and over and over again. So by the time I get something I'm willing to like show to people or try to get published, it's pretty polished, and as a result, the changes tend to be not as great as with other people who may be faster than
Mhm.
me at the expense of being a little rawer and therefore having to do more revision with an editor at a later stage.
is maybe, I don't know, you tell me what you think. Knowing you're going to, write something for a blog as opposed to being published. It's just knowing that once it's printed, unless you do a reprint, that this is going to be, locked in forever. Does that, up your game a little
Well,
bit when you write?
no, I mean, I think it's, well, when I write, I haven't been doing as much blogging in recent years as I used to, but nonetheless, when I blog, I force myself to write much faster and therefore much less carefully and much more sloppily. Sometimes when I like what I wrote on the blog, I end up turning it into a chapter of a book, but then there's massive rewriting and it's very, very different. So,
Mm-hmm.
like you
Okay.
mentioned, I wrote about Grace Jones's corporate cannibal video first on my blog, which anybody can still find for free. And then I rewrote it when I put it in a book. And I think the book form is better, but I mean, it was because it was different between, I mean, the ideas were already there in the blog version, but I really reworked it really carefully and spent a lot of time on, making sure when I published it for a published
Mm-hmm.
book as opposed to a blog. So there's both.
Yeah. Now you do know I have a great love for Grace Jones. I
Yeah,
was buying her records in the late '70s when I was in high school, but this was
yeah.
during her disco phase before she went new wave and art rock, and which I
Well,
loved.
yeah.
But
Well, I mean, she had
or,
like, I mean, I don't know. I wish I could see her live, but the last
yeah.
time she was in Detroit, it was like $150 for a ticket, so I didn't go.
But
Um,
what kills me is before she, I don't know, went Hollywood, let's say, maybe
yeah,
early '80s, when I
yeah,
had heard from someone that she had played this little gig down in Belltown in
yeah.
Seattle.
Mm-hmm.
And what was that club that was considered the closest we had to kind of a new wave club? It was
I'm
down
not
on
sure.
First Avenue, I think. Can't
I
remember.
remember the Crocodile Cafe, but you probably mean something else.
Yeah, this is like a live dance club, kind of
Yeah,
alternative. Maybe it was called Rex back
I
then
don't know.
before it
I don't
changed
remember.
over. But it's like those mythical things you think, oh my God, I would have done anything to have seen her in this
Yeah,
small, intimate club.
sure. No, that's always, I think one always has those regrets unless you're so hip to things that you actually get to see all those things.
Right. But when you're talking about music videos, you know what I love about YouTube is when you find a video you never knew existed. And I remember,
Yeah,
and I don't even think it was a video Grace Jones did. I think she appeared on like a show in Europe. And this
yeah.
was her segment in the show, but it was a really nicely decorated set and,
Mm-hmm.
filmed without the audience in view. So it kind of
Yeah,
felt like a video. And
yeah.
I think, oh my goodness, back in the day, I would have killed to have found something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well,
Do you ever discover stuff like that?
sometimes, I mean, usually it's stuff. I mean, there are a lot of other things like fan videos or just live performance videos. I mostly look for like, you know, directed music videos because, they do a lot of it. But I mean, I often find, artists who I wouldn't have heard the music by if I didn't find the video first.
Hmm.
And even, with more mainstream stuff, it's sometimes, you know, I don't necessarily. There are artists who I appreciate the music a lot more because of the videos. If I just heard the music, which I might have anyway, it says, "Oh, this is okay," but I wouldn't have gotten obsessed with it. I wouldn't have really paid attention to it. And then when I see the videos, it's much more. That somehow hooks me in more. That's
Hmm.
my.
Yeah.
That's me. That's not everybody feels it.
Okay, we're going to go in the final stretch here and hopefully not make too many waves, but we're going to get a little darker. We're going to get a little grittier. But, you were in Seattle still when Reservoir Dogs came out in '92.
Yeah,
I mean, did you see that? Like, was that at the Seven Gables or the Varsity? Do you
I saw
remember
it.
what theater?
No, I remember that they had a screening at the. I mean, one of the blind screenings that didn't tell you in advance at the Seattle Film Festival at the Egyptian, and I didn't go. I wasn't going to the Secret Festival that
Uh,
year, but I heard about it from people.
that had so much buzz, didn't it?
Yeah,
And I didn't quite realize the impact at the time. I just knew that indie cinema was so in the air. We knew it existed, but he then became the great hope of all indie filmmakers of, oh my God, I can do what he did. I can be discovered. But then
yeah,
there's this whole ripple effect. And then Clerks came out. And
yeah,
then there came the whole rash of, oh, and then El Mariachi.
Yeah.
And that was the other big, oh my goodness, he made this for $7,000 and look, and Hollywood discovered him. There was something in the air in the 90s with all that.
Yeah, sure.
And there's a freshness to it, but at the same time, then there was a ripple effect. And I think a lot of people thought I can be like Tarantino and mimic his
Well,
success if I go back and appropriate some of these exploitation
well,
themes and
yeah.
make them palatable to a new audience.
Well, I mean, when you say there's several kinds. I mean, one ripple effect is that whenever anything succeeds, lots of people imitate it.
Hmm.
So after Pulp Fiction, there were a lot of films by other directors which proved that just because you have, gangsters who have witty dialogue doesn't mean that you're making great film. And then after, Blue Velvet came out, there were a lot of people saying, oh, tried to do David Lynch films. Oh, this is just super weird. But no, a lot of them were, again, completely lame. So,
Hmm.
it's hard, you set up a style that gets imitated, but, the kind of flash of genius which makes it really work is not something you can quantify or imitate very really. So you never know what's going to happen.
Well, you mentioned Lynch, so we have to insert that because that's the other thing in Seattle. Even
Yeah.
though Twin Peaks was kind of phenomenon that first season throughout the country,
Yeah.
the Northwest was ground zero for that.
Well, my last few years, I left Seattle in 2004, and the last 4 or 5 years after the first season of Twin Peaks, whenever people would visit one out of town, I'd take them to Snoqualmie Falls, so they
Hmm.
could see, the falls and the lodge and the Double R Diner and stuff like that.
Yeah. And I remember just there was the other show, Northern Exposure, which took
Yeah.
place in Alaska, but they did also shot that outside of Seattle.
Yeah.
I think up in Roslyn.
Yeah. Right.
And there was just whole feel like, oh, Seattle's finally, this area is becoming the big film community we always thought it would be. They're going to shoot lots of TV shows. And although several years later, then you have a big show like that hospital one where they don't actually
Yeah.
film it in Seattle.
Well, a lot of that, again, I keep coming back to this, has to do with economics. I mean, this happened in the 21st century with Detroit for about 6 or 7 years, maybe 8 years, maybe 5 to 8 years. I don't remember exactly. The state of Michigan had this kind of incentive program where they give people tax write-offs to make movies in Detroit. So lots of people made movies in Detroit which weren't even set in Detroit, but they were set. I mean, I remember there was some movie, it never even came out because something happened. But anyway,
Mm-hmm.
like when I was living in my neighborhood, I was living, this is like 2008, 2009. They were shooting a movie set in New Orleans, but it was being shot in Detroit. And one of
Oh,
the
wow.
places they were shooting was like 2 blocks from my house. So I could go over and see the stuff. And they're like putting all these things like these beads over the trees in front of people's houses. So it looked like in New Orleans during Mardi Gras. But it was ridiculous. But I mean, where I live now, I mean, there's now a building
Hmm.
there, but,
Right down the
they were
block.
shooting the third Harold and Kumar movie, 3D, Harold and Kumar 3D Christmas, was being shot like a few blocks from my house. Because again, this is like when, but then they took the, tax incentives away because of, it's all politics. And so, whereas they shoot other cities and they go in Detroit and pretend it was other cities, now they shoot, when they want to pretend it's Detroit, they shoot it in other cities because it's all just where they get the best financial deal. I mean, it's kind of
Eh,
ridiculous, but
Well, speaking of, so you were still in Seattle too when we had quite the international event, which was WTO,
mm-hmm.
which is kind of funny to think that was over 20 years ago. But
Yep, it was.
I remember, so I'm not even thinking about the riots, even though I remember I was working downtown when those were brewing, and I got to see
Yeah,
some of that, before nightfall. But
yeah,
it hit home the most because besides everyone thinks of the riots, but there are actually meetings going on. There's a whole
yeah,
purpose for this. And
yeah,
Clinton was in town. He was there for all this. And I just remember during his visit, I hope I'm remembering this right.
yeah.
He wanted to go to a church service. And I'm thinking with Hillary, I don't know. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know if she was along, but so the
Yeah.
church was like half a block from where I lived. So I kind of
Oh,
remember
yeah.
one day the street being blocked off,
Yeah.
helicopters overhead, and it's just kind of funny how Seattle during the 90s had this weird vibe to it. It's still is it's never really
Yeah.
recovered.
Well, I don't know. I was reading about the, Black Lives Matter protests this past summer, and they had Seattle, Capitol Hill in Seattle, and they had a liberated zone for a couple of weeks and stuff. So I don't know.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's again, I don't know. I avoided downtown because I didn't want to get caught up in it, but I was astonished to see that they just bring the cops in and start, beating everybody up and stuff for no reason.
Yeah, and I think that's also a moment when, real life becomes more interesting than anything you could write. And I think now, the media in some cases is more enthralling than any fiction you can make up, and more than ever, fiction has to compete with the news and reality.
Well, one thing a lot of science fiction writers have complained about in recent years is that they write something and then, by the time it gets published, it's already actually happened. So they're not writing this, if you're doing near future science fiction, something like that. I mean, I don't know. I still think people can invent weird stuff which hasn't happened yet, but
Yes. Well, we're going to move on to something here, although it's going to kill me. If was Clinton in office in '99? I don't think he was.
Yes, he was.
Okay, that was right before then. George W. came in
Was
2000.
elected in 2000 and took office in January 20th, 2001. Yeah.
Okay, so probably was Clinton. Okay, I'm not losing it here. So
No.
we talk about, TV has in some ways become even more influential than film. But I think in the past couple decades, there's been these movie or these TV series that have really changed TV. One being
Yeah.
Oz, the Men in Prison
Mhm.
film, or a series which I thought was, oh my God, that blew me away when I first saw it, that kind of
Yeah.
violence on TV, and then
Mhm.
Sopranos.
Yeah.
But the thing that really changed it for me, and I think this was early 2000s, was Nip Tuck.
Mhm.
Even before American Horror Story, although you can see
Yeah.
some of the beginnings of that. And I just think to me, that's been, that's when, Ryan Murphy and company really delved in and I think made a very artful show. It was a beautiful looking show, but really took
Mhm.
the gritty themes of exploitation cinema and cleaned them up a little bit and put them on cable
Yeah.
TV. Well,
Well,
what
it's
are your
hard.
thoughts on that?
I never saw Nip and Tuck, though I've read about it. But I mean, I don't actually watch that many TV series, partly because it seems too much of a commitment to watch something for hours and hours and hours and hours. But
That
I
you
mean,
watch music videos?
that's why I watch music videos because it's only 3 to 5 minutes long instead of hours and hours.
Oh, you
I mean,
gotta dig into some of these TV
I
series. I
mean,
mean,
I,
that's
I
where
mean, I watched a few of them and I read about a lot more. But I don't know. I mean, again, remember, TV is different because we have, cable and online, and it's very different from having a limited series on HBO or Showtime, like the last Twin Peaks was, than having
Mhm.
something on,
Did you like that last
Yeah,
season of Twin
I totally
Peaks?
loved it. I totally loved it.
So
David
it
Lynch
didn't
is
tarnish the
no,
first
no.
2
David Lynch is
seasons
a
for you.
pure genius, and he's doing something different than he did with the earlier one. But they're both great. That's how I feel.
Excellent. Well, by the way, did you ever go to fan conventions? Like
Oh well, sometimes not very often.
Comic-Cons?
I not very often. I mean, I find them interesting, but I almost rarely. I mean, basically, it's too expensive to go to one if it's not in your city. And actually, I was going to go to this big science fiction convention in Detroit, but um, and I was planning to go, but then basically there was an issue with my then partner, so I had to take care of the kids instead of her taking
Okay.
care of the kids, so I couldn't go.
Oh,
But
well, in the past few years, some of the people from Twin Peaks have been showing up at, like, horror fan conventions, and I remember I went to several,
yeah,
and I was always afraid to go up to the Twin
hmm
Peaks tables because 'cause I'm
yeah.
a fan, but you know how you just don't want it to be tarnished for you or the actors to not live up to your expectation?
Well, I have a friend at Wayne State in Detroit who, after he graduated, I think he got a master's degree um, in English at Wayne State or in journalism or something. Anyway, he's now a journalist, and what he does is he does celebrity interviews, and
Cool.
they go in various newspapers and other media, sometimes radio, but sometimes just like print. But he always writes about it. So sometimes you just talk to him. He was my student 15 years ago, but it's like like just last week, he said, "Oh, I just interviewed, can't even remember the name of the actor, the guy who played the evil mayor in the third season of Buffy the Vampire Slayer."
Oh, cool. Yeah,
And so,
I
and
can
so
picture him.
he said, "Oh, it was so great talking to him." And he goes, and the guy obviously it's his most famous role, so he still does conventions and stuff like that. But
Oh yeah,
you know,
if you do the convention circuit, hey,
so I often see these things that whenever any celebrity, either because they're from local or because they're just coming around for a convention or something, gets interviewed by this former student of mine. It's kind of great to see that.
well, you would love the sci-fi conventions. They even have,
Yeah.
the big World Con, which, is
Well,
mostly sci-fi writers.
no, I'd love to. I mean, I'd love to go to a Worldcon. It's, well, there was the time was closest a few years ago. It was in San Jose, California. So I theoretically could have gone, but it would have cost too much money, so I didn't.
So a year and a half ago, I was at a Crypticon in Seattle, and it
Yeah,
was the third time I had seen like a Twin Peaks presence at one of these conventions. I thought,
yeah.
this is silly. So, my favorite of that universe is the Fire Walk with Me movie,
Mm-hmm.
based on Twin Peaks and the story
Yeah,
of Laura Palmer. So they had Cheryl Lee, the actress who plays Laura
yeah.
Palmer. And I said, look, this is stupid. I've got to go up there. And it's the one and only time I've paid a
Mm-hmm.
celebrity for an
Yeah,
autograph, because kind of on principle, I never did that.
yeah.
I said, I'm
Sure.
going to bite the bullet this time, shell out the 45 bucks
Yeah.
and get a picture taken with Cheryl Lee.
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of them need that. It supplements their income if they don't have loads and loads of roles and stuff.
I
So
think of that as kind of paying their Patreon account,
yeah, it's sort of like that. Yeah, I agree.
because just to keep going and doing what they do. But so back to nip tuck and just this whole pushing the envelope. I mean, when I first saw that show, it had to do with plastic surgery, and
Yeah.
I thought they were doing real plastic surgery. The special effects were that good.
Mm-hmm.
But then when these things get to a point of, well, it's not just enough to show a nose job or a facelift. How can we top ourselves every episode with
Yeah.
something more gory or outlandish or obscure? And then even outside the surgery, how can we push our storyline with, things that in the past we would only see in a grindhouse theater?
Mm-hmm.
And I know that, now, American Horror Story pushes the envelope that
Yeah.
same way. But now American Horror Story has its imitators, or,
Mm-hmm.
people want to
Yeah.
be more like that. So at what point do we paint ourselves into a corner where we're so basing everything on shock value and not classic storytelling?
Well, I think there's movies, the whole history of movies, there's always been two poles. One is narrative, the other is shock. And movies have, ever since 1895, movies have gone back and forth between those two poles in different combinations. And, so, I mean, I have, I deplore when things become so, like, this is really too much. Okay, they have to go, that becomes boring. But, I'm always at least hopeful that there'll be at least sometimes that there'll be chance for doing something fresh. I mean, it's never impossible to invent something new, even if a lot of people don't do it. I mean, eventually it's going to happen. And so I have this faith that it will eventually. But, you may
Mhm.
have to go
Did
through a
you,
lot of crap before you get to that. But,
what do you think of people taking exploitation and turning it into more of an art film? Because I have a couple thoughts. One is I'm all for art. I'm all for, self-expression if they want to use those as tools. But at the
yeah.
same time, I just don't like it when somebody acts like they're being more clever than the original exploitation film that they're using.
Well, again, we talked about that a little earlier. I mean, it's true. There's a danger for too much self-conscious, too much self-congratulatory. I'm doing this tongue-in-cheek, which somebody else 30 years ago did totally naively, and often there's a loss for that. Again, all I can say is that bad things happen and good things can happen also. So there's like, you just have to look for a lot of stuff because you're right. A lot of time it'll just become like that. But there are other times where, some of these things can lead to, something new, something creative, something which really makes your brain work in a different way or look at a different thing. So you just have to suffer through all the crap in order to get to a few things that are, I mean, it's like, have you ever heard of Sturgeon's Law? Theodore
No,
Sturgeon. Theodore Sturgeon was a famous science fiction writer who wrote in the 50s, 60s, 70s.
right? Heard of
And
him.
okay, so once somebody asked, this has become known in the internet as Sturgeon. So once somebody asked him, well, you write science fiction and blah, blah, but isn't it true that 95% of science fiction is crap? And Sturgeon replied, 95% of anything is crap. And he's right. I mean,
Yeah,
that's true of high art, low art. It's true of exploitation. It's true of, mainstream entertainment. It's true of everything. So you just have to find that good 5%. I mean, against the
right.
background of the other stuff, I mean,
Well, I was talking to someone the other day about I can watch a movie and dislike things about it, but I can still find things to like. And
yeah,
we live in such a society now with people leaving online reviews and knee-jerk reactions.
mhm,
Everything's either 1 star or 10 stars. They either love it or hate it.
yeah,
And I see so much less nuance of saying, I see, you could say, well, I see what this director was going for. I don't think
yeah.
they totally succeeded, but I thought they were really effective doing this. You know what I mean?
hmm Well, again, I think that's always been the case. I mean, it's not that people aren't saying more nuanced things, but often it gets drowned out by the number of people. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's like I have a complicated relation to like fan cultures because in very ways, but certain things I feel very fanish. But often when I see what the fans themselves say, either I'm not fans of the same thing they're fans of, or I think they're going to, I mean, I don't know exactly. I read about science fiction a lot, and I'm definitely a fan. And often I think, oh, here's a weird, mind-blowing idea in this story, even if other parts of it are kind of boring. But the only thing the fans want to talk about is A, it was plausible, B, it wasn't plausible. And that's, so I sort of feel a lot is missing. But I think, there always something good. There will always be more than what other people, as I said earlier, there's often more than what the artists themselves was putting into it.
Mhm.
Something just synergy happens, something magical happens in works of art, which makes good ones really go in other dimensions. But there's no way to plan for that, and a lot of people won't notice it. So I don't know.
Now, are those your kids in the background?
One of she's talking about I have two daughters who are 18 and 16. The
Oh,
18-year-old lives with me. The 16-year-old lives with her mother. So my daughter is talking to her friend of hers on the phone right now, and that's what you're
oh,
hearing in the
so
background.
so you are a father of two daughters,
Yeah.
that are both grown up or almost grown up. How has becoming a father changed your whole outlook on film theory?
I'm not sure I can say that in a direct way. I mean, it's, being a good parent is like the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. And I'm not sure I did it as well as I wish I could have. But, I think it's, I don't know.
When you sit down with them, what are the movies you say, "Oh, girls, you got to watch this. I love this movie."
I mean, they have different kind of tastes. So like my older daughter loves to watch stuff like American Horror Story. My younger daughter has some like Korean friends in school, and so she loves to watch Korean melodramas, which you can get on like Netflix.
Oh, those are fun.
So yeah, so they're all different.
Are they like your go-to when you're researching? Like, do you say, "Hey, what are the hot music videos right now?"
Actually, no, because um, neither of them really likes videos. They mostly just listen to the music, on headphones instead of watching the videos. So neither of them is
Hmm.
really that big a music video fan per se. They're often surprised when I like somebody who is popular among their age group, but is not necessarily popular among other people.
Hmm. So I'm going to wrap up with one final thing, or we could talk about exploitation forever, but
Hmm
for another time. I think we got some of the basics, but one interesting thing in your resume, because you went to Yale, which I
Yeah,
discovered Camille Paglia went there too, although
yeah,
much well before you did.
yeah. No, I never met her.
But I read on your bio that you took classes with Harold Bloom.
Yes, he was a teacher of mine. I took a lot of classes with him. I
And I
mean,
think a lot of people, the new generation doesn't realize just how much influence he had as a literary critic. And,
well,
what are your memories of him?
he was very brilliant and singular and very self-absorbed. Okay, so I mean, I can say both good and bad things, but I valued studying under him, though I wouldn't say what anything I do has much to do with anything he ever did. but he seemed I mean, basically, what I found good about him was that he was very original, had his own take on everything, and didn't care about what anybody else thought about everything, basically. And,
Mhm.
it's good I think it's probably good to know more about what's going on around you than he was willing to do. But on the other hand, I think there's something admirable about, not just following the crowd, but, sticking to your own guns. And also, I mean, he would just, his classes, I mean, I don't teach the way he did. His classes, we'd have a text to read and he'd brilliantly free associate the text for 2 hours. And it wasn't like conventional class, but I learned a lot from it, even regardless of what the particular works were, just by seeing how his mind worked. So, I mean, there are negative things to be said about him as well, but I won't say them because, I had a good experience. And
Right.
I wouldn't call myself a disciple of his or a follower of his, but, you just run into people who are kind of extraordinary and stand out, even if you don't want to do what they do. And that's how I feel
Mhm.
about Harold Bloom.
Well, most memorable people, whether they're, an academic or, creator of some sort, but, to really make your mark and leave something behind, you create something new or
Yeah.
you show people how to look at something in a new way. And I know you've gone through different philosophical disciplines, especially, when I first knew of you and, just reading about, French philosophy and
Yeah.
the philosophers that, you looked at. What would you say you have produced? All these influences you've had, and all these different people who you've tried out. Several of their ideas. What new idea do you think you're formulating?
Well, I don't know whether I am. I mean, I don't consider myself a philosopher, though I like to read philosophers, and I've taken a lot from many philosophers. But I mean, I mostly find when I write best about a pre-existing work, whether it's a literary text like a science fiction novel or a short story, or whether it's a movie or a video or whatever. I mean, I think it's a mutual process. I mean, I had a interchange. I wrote something about a story by a science fiction writer who I know slightly, I've met a couple of times, and I sent her what I wrote about her story, and she said she liked it, and she said, "Oh wow, I just wrote this story, and it turns out to have all these theoretical implications related to these philosophical things which I had no idea about." And I said, "Well, it goes both ways because this story is so wild and imaginative, and it has all this amazing, weird, crazy stuff I never would think of in a million years. And you thought of it and put it into a story, and so
Hmm.
um, that's so it goes both ways. And I mean, I don't know. I mean, I try
Hmm.
as I'm in a good position because I'm older and I've been around for a while. I've published a lot of books, so I can sort of get away with writing what I want. Though it doesn't make it easy, but that isn't true of everybody in academia because
Hmm.
you have certain. I mean, I'm 66 years old, so I'll be I'm not going to retire for a while because my kids still have to go to college and stuff. But I sort of am freer than people are in other academic positions where their jobs are less secure, where they're not getting as much money or whatever.
Well, even though it's valuable to analyze films and other works of art, books, at a certain point, when do you just let go of your analytical mind and you're just a fan like the rest of us and just let go and just enjoy what you're watching?
I think I don't think it's an either or. I think I do both of those at the same time. I mean,
Mhm.
I really don't think on one part I'm watching, doing this analytic thing. I mean, I obviously react to something differently if I decide to write about it. But my first appreciation of anything is just, I think the same way other people do as fans. I mean, I read something and say, oh
Mhm.
wow, if I like it, I say, oh wow, this blows me away in some way. If it doesn't, I put it aside and take up something else. I mean, I don't. My trouble as a fan is that I tend to be fanish towards things which nobody else likes. Except me.
This last year has been sort of like a sci-fi political thriller.
Yep.
Do you have hope going into these next few years?
I'm not. I'm pretty pessimistic, though. I try to avoid falling into the black hole of it. But when I don't know, the last 4 years have been horrific. I mean, I'm really relieved that we're about to be rid of Donald Trump because everything's done so horrible and awful for this country and for people in particular and in general. I have no hope that it's going to be much better. I mean, we won't have the worst things, but so I mean, I voted for Joe Biden because I needed to get rid of Trump. I don't think Joe Biden is at all imaginative or is going to do anything that really reforms things or really changes America in a ways. I mean, I think with the climate crisis just getting worse and worse, I mean, it's just, I don't know. I've heard about in Seattle, they had, you had these weeks when, because of fires, the sky was completely clouded over and stuff. Never happened when I used to live there. I mean, it's just, I have friends who recently retired and moved to Berkeley, California, and they said they were always sure this is where they want to live the rest of their life, but now they're saying, well, after 3 summers in a row, and there was like 4 or 5 weeks when the sky was so polluted that it was dangerous to go outside, they kind of wonder. And when they had to deal with their house, they never had to leave. They had to always be ready because there would be some possibility the fire would spread to where they live. I mean, so I don't know. I mean, I think the combination of economic inequality and climate disaster is just getting worse and worse. And though I don't have much hope that we have a government, I mean, despite the improvement which is about to come, I don't see that we have a government with sufficient imagination and will to actually deal with those problems. So I'm very pessimistic. I'm hoping I'll die before it gets really too horrible, but I'm worried about my kids when they get older.
As a professor, seeing, having the ability to teach directly to your students in the same room face to face.
Well, I haven't been doing that this year because of COVID. I mean, it's been weird since March, for the end of that semester, and then all this fall semester, I've been doing it entirely online. And so I don't really meet the students. I videotape lectures or write things and they respond if they're on their own time.
Do you think that'll become the new normal for your profession?
I don't know. I mean, there are pluses and minuses. I mean, I think a lot is lost by not being physically in the same space, in the same classroom. On the other hand, there are some positive things, like students who were too shy to ever talk in class are now, when they can write on a bulletin board on their own speed, I actually get more feedback on certain things as a result. So I try to see pluses as well as minuses, but it's not a great situation overall.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to wrap up and give you the last word. And what I especially love, we talked earlier, is if you are working on a new book, just to give us a sneak peek on just whether it's a book or what you're writing right now, what's on your mind creatively?
Well, I have a book which I actually finished over a year ago, but won't come out until almost a year from now because, especially during the pandemic, publishing has been slowed down. But it's a book about science fiction. It's called Extreme Fabulations. It just looks at a number of science fiction novels and stories which have this weird and extreme scenarios, but which can actually tell us stuff about the world. And what I'm writing now, I'm working on more science fiction stuff, and I'm mostly writing either in science fiction or in music videos. So I could list titles, but I'm not sure that would necessarily help. There's lots of stuff.
And do you have a publisher lined up for the science fiction book?
Well, the one coming out a year from now, it's now being processed. So it's like going to copy editing. And that's Goldsmiths University Press in the UK.
Excellent. See, they love you in England.
Well, so, I mean, I don't know. Some people do, some people don't. It's like, as I told you, when I write science fiction things about science fiction works by living authors, sometimes they get to see them. And sometimes they say, oh, thank you, this is great. You really got it, what I was trying to say. And other times they say, who is this person and why is he saying these stupid, idiotic things about my books? And I had both reactions. And of course, the first one's gratifying, the second one's very disturbing, but it's inevitable when you're writing about stuff that living people are doing.
Well,
I never try to be mean. I only write about things I like, but nonetheless, not every author is going to necessarily like what I write about their stuff.
That's what I like about you. You hit hard, but you're not mean. You're not mean-spirited.
I try. I don't know. I don't like. I don't see the point. I mean, I understand in political things you have to criticize bad things happening, but I don't see there's a science fiction novel which I think is really crap, and there are ones. Obviously, I don't write articles about how they're really crap. I just ignore them. This life is too short to spend time on that.
Too short. And what's that movie again you said I had to watch?
Oh,
Detention?
Detention. There's several films with that title, unfortunately. Detention 2011, directed by Joseph Kahn, Kahn.
Okay, I'll figure that out. I won't give you any homework, but if you want to, take a glimpse at Nip Tuck. I would be so curious
Okay,
to get your
well,
reaction.
it's on my. Oh, I put it on my list. I mean, I don't have. The list is way too long at this point. But I just,
Well, I'm really glad we had a chance to get caught up today. We
yeah,
probably
this is really
a
nice,
couple
Kelly.
decades too long, but
Well,
if
it's
you're
great.
ever back in Seattle, we need to go back to Linda's Tavern and have a drink.
Okay, I don't know when I'll be next in Seattle. It's been a while. I was last there in 2013, I think. It's been a while since I
Oh my
visited.
goodness. Well, it sounds like you've really established a nice home for yourself in Detroit. You think you're going to retire there?
Who knows? I mean, I love Detroit in the summer. Detroit's a really interesting place, but I really don't like the winter. I mean, I really don't like cold winter. So, aside from, if not for the fire, well, I'd love to. So my fantasy is to retire to California, but there are two problems to that. One is that California is so unbelievably expensive, I may never be able to afford it. And the other is that though they have great weather, now they're having this fire season every summer. It's really scary. So who knows?
Oh my God. Now, do you also have a website if people want to go to?
Mostly it's my blog. It's my last name, www.shaviro.com/B blog.
Yeah, I recommend going dig deep. You actually have excerpts from your books on there too.
Well, as I said, I often write blog entries and then several years later I turn them into book chapters with massive rewriting, but you get a version of it, a preliminary version from
Get a lot of freebies. Okay, his name is Stephen Shaviro. He is not only the smartest man in the room, but he also has a big heart. So I really appreciate you being on the show, Stephen.
Thank you. It was great talking with you, Kelly, and catching up after many years.